Hey, let's talk about community and population health, chapter 25 and 27 test review. So for this piece, I'm actually going to review violence. So let's get started. Okay, violence. Just so you know, it's a learned behavior. Usually an abuser is been abused and it's usually generational, so they see it. So one of the big things that we want to do is start to cut or break that generational mold of abuse. But it's a learned behavior. People aren't just born abusive. They see it, they learn it, and then they actually live it. So I want you to understand that. Money or the lack of can cause people to be violent. So one of the biggest issues that couples and people have are either too much money and there's a greed involvement, but most of the time it's the lack of money. It is the struggle that people have. And what we see is because of that, we can see spousal abuse or intimate partner abuse, just depending. I want you also to understand that it's the stress of that. Money can just do a lot to a lot of people, and especially the lack of. The stress levels go up, people can become depressed, different issues happen, and violence can occur. Just so you know, young men are the most likely to be assaulted in our communities. And abusers have most likely been abused. It's a learned behavior, but they've been most likely abused. And I want you to understand that. And also, verbal abuse is abuse. So someone might not ever touch you, but verbal abuse is abuse. It can cause so much harm emotionally, psychologically. You might not have the physical bruises, but you have the internal, the mental abuse, and that can be even more harmful sometimes than physical abuse. All of it is bad though. So just know verbal abuse is abuse. So if you have a parent who might not physically hit their child, but they verbally constantly are telling them how bad they are or how wrong they are or how horrible they are, that is considered a form of abuse, and we need to understand that. The abuser believes violence is the way to manage conflict. So if it's a learned behavior, most of the time someone that has been abused or in that is how they deal with conflict. So I'm not going to talk it out. I want to punch it out. I want to throw something. I want to kick, spit, have a fit, do whatever. That is what an abuser believes is how to manage conflict. So there definitely is something that can be addressed here, and we'll address that on a later slide. Intimate partner abuse. You can sometimes see the word love. Love is used. I love her. I didn't mean to hurt her. I love him. I didn't mean to hurt him. And that is lots of times the word love in quotation marks is used after the abuse has happened. And we have to start to explain or help or find the help for these victims so that they understand that love is not being hit or love is not being yelled at or demeaned. It's just a matter of understanding that's not love. And unfortunately, the abuser that thinks that way needs that help too, because that's got to be broken. This isn't how you show love, by abusing someone. If you have someone that is abused and they come in, and you've had multiple times they've come in as a client or a patient, and they are telling you that they've been abused, they have signs of abuse, they're reporting abuse, yet they're still being abused. One of the things that we need to do as nurses is help with forming an escape plan. Where can they go? We need to get you out of this situation, because most of the time when we can't remove the victim from these situations, it can escalate to murder. And we don't want that. If you look at the news today, if you're watching those things that are out there, we're seeing a lot of that, where this abuse or the stress or whatever's going on, it escalates, and it escalates till there is a murder that happens. And that we see it a lot in intimate partner abuse. Women who have reported abuse or who have reported, it should be ED there, I apologize for that, abuse in the past are at the highest risk for intimate partner homicide. These women have come in, they're bruised, they're broken bones, they're beat. You talk to them, they report it, they end up going back. There's a lot with everything that happens with this in this mental. Lots of times women feel like, well, I deserve it. They start to think that way. One of the things in your book that I love is it addresses how to approach these victims, and it's not to say what happened, but it's to say who hit you. Go ahead and address it so that the woman can just answer it. Lots of times when we ask, well, what happened? The actual victim then will try to make it something better. Well, I fell, or I was didn't do what I was supposed to do, and I should have had it done. You know, there is a lot that goes on in this world to understand. And it's difficult for us to understand, especially if we're not abused or have never been in an abusive relationship. But one of the things you can do is definitely be respectful, be empathetic, and also ask exactly, you know, who hit you. If you saw somebody with a big old shiner in their eye, are you going to think they fell and hit the curb? No, you're going to say, who punched you in the eye, right? But we would do it in a very respectful way. What leads to increased violence? No social support. There's no one out there supporting them out in their world. There's nothing. This can lead to increased violence. Feeling powerless. People that are knocked down and feel powerless all the time, they can actually eventually stand up and become violent. Feeling powerless is not a healthy mental state. People that watch and see violence all the time, people that sit and watch things on television. Unfortunately, I feel like the media, lots of times we just see violence and negativity over and over and over again. And what does that do to your psyche? It makes you feel negative. It creates this environment for you. So watching and seeing violence at all time, playing video games of violence, these things can lead to increased violence. So we need to be very careful, especially with children. If children are watching this on television, if they're seeing this is how people relate or react to situations, it can create that learned behavior. So they think that's how they should act. So we should be concerned. Also a feeling of crowd, an environment of being crowded or feeling crowded. What happens if somebody's on you all the time? You can't express yourself. You can't have that downtime. You can't have that moment that you need. When you live in very close environments, if you work in very close environments, increased violence can take place. And this is something I didn't add in here, but it's kind of an interesting fact too, is we see a lot more violence with increased temperature outside. The hotter it is, the hotter the summer day, we seem to see more violence. It kind of agitates people a little more. Now, with the lack of money or issues with money, we see violence during holidays. We see a lot of different things that happen during this time frame. Suicide is on an increase during holidays. It's a time of depression. It's a time that people start to really struggle because we're trying to do something during that time. But the temperature thing I find very interesting. The hotter it is, if it's 120 out, we seem to see more violence out there than if it's a normal, wonderful, beautiful fall day like here where we live when it's 60 degrees out. We don't seem to see it as much. And also, believe it or not, depression does not feed into violence. So people that are depressed, we don't usually see them become violent. Usually depression, we see them shut down, withdraw, sleep. You don't see violence out towards others. I mean, depression can lead to suicide though. So it could be violence to self. So we need to be very careful. And depression feeds many different things out there with our psyche and our issues. But depression, if you saw that out there in the world of NCLEX and nursing, it's not what leads to, it doesn't feed violence. So if you see someone who's depressed, it doesn't necessarily mean they're violent, but if they're depressed and they're depressed because they can't go do what they want to do. And especially like say a parent who wants to be out with their friends or who wants to go out and party all night long and can't, they can then have violent behavior towards a child or a spouse, something that's in that environment or situation that's causing them to have to stay where they are. Then you might see it. But depression alone, not normally, just FYI. Rape, it is an act of violence, and we all know that. Why rape? People that rape, it's for power and control. It is not a sexual pleasure. Can they have sexual pleasure after those things? Sure. There's a lot of different, and I'm not teaching psych nursing, I'm just teaching community and population health. But rape is an act of violence, and usually the rapist, it's for power and control, just so you know, over that person for whatever reason. Victimization is the feeling most people have after being raped. Why me? They're attacking, they targeted me. We get that. And that is a normal feeling and should be there. Why, why me? Why, what's going on? But knowing that and understanding it is how you can address that person if they have been raped. And it's a very sensitive subject. It's something we also have to remember to listen to these patients or clients that come in and help get them and plug them into the help that they need, because there's a lot of issue with this. If you actually have a rape victim in an ER, we actually have nurses that go in and take care of all of the evidence, and so that they can collect that for the police or an investigation if needed. Just an FYI. Neglect. We see neglect a lot out in our community, especially in a lower socioeconomic area. We can see neglect, but down when we get to the emotional piece and I talk about the categories of child neglect, I am going to make a point about that. It's not always the lower socioeconomic, but it is the failure to meet the child's needs. That includes housing and can be, it's not all, but it can be one or more. Just so you know, food. If they're just not feeding them or can't feed them, it's a form of neglect. Clothing, if they can't provide the proper clothing or attire. Education, they're not getting them to school. They refuse to get them to school. They refuse to wake them up and get them on the school bus to take them to school. They're neglecting their educational needs. Healthcare, if you're not providing healthcare, they're not getting their immunizations, if they're not getting the things in healthcare that they need, if they're sick and they're not going to the doctor and getting the proper medicines. And that includes dentistry. If there is a lack of dental care, you're not providing or making them brush their teeth, and then they have dental caries and they're unable to go and they end up losing their teeth. Or we see children with a lot of fillings because of cavities, because there is a lack of dentistry or dental care. There are two categories that I want you to understand that have to deal with child neglect. It's the physical, and that is what we're seeing above: the housing, the food, the clothing, the education, the healthcare, and dental included. But the emotional, there can be emotional neglect. So you might have parents that provide the housing, that provide all the food, clothing, all of those things. And we see that, we can see this emotional piece, not only in the lower socioeconomic, they're just not there emotionally for their child, but also in the higher. We can have parents that go away and aren't there for their child when there's a need. They just kind of provide for them and allow them to live out there in their own world. And that is a form of neglect. Either way, the child is not getting what they need physically or emotionally. Now, forms of abuse on page 495 in the book that we're using, if anybody's out there, we're using actually Stanhope's Foundations of Population Health and Community and Public Health Nursing. It's a great book. And thank you for that. But these are on page 495, and there's even more. But hitting, punching, slapping, strangling, shaking, confining, burning, freezing, pushing, kicking, biting, punching, and it goes on and on and on, are forms of abuse. Some of them we would be very familiar with, understanding that they're abuse, and then some you should read through on that page. You might not understand that that's abuse, or you might, but it's a good review. Just kind of look at it. So if you get a client that presents into the ER, you get a student, your school nurse, and they've come in to see you, and these are things they're either doing or they say are being done to them, you need to understand that that's abuse. Or we start to look for injury, that this is what has happened. So if I ask someone, where did that bruise come from? Or what happened? You don't always want to, if they've got a big black eye, who hit you. But in this situation is that bruise is very odd, did something happen? And if they share with you the punching, the slapping, the strangling, or, whatever, you have bruises around the neck, that's strangling. We've seen that. We have bite marks on people, that's biting. We have burn marks. You can have cigarette burns. You can have where they put their hand on the burners, things like that. When we start to see that, we know those are forms of abuse, and we should identify as nurses and intervene as needed. Physical health problems for abused women. We'll see this presented. Women that are abused, they can have chronic headaches. They come in, they have chronic headache after headache, palpitations, the heart's palpitating, sleep or appetite disturbances. They can't seem to sleep, or they sleep all the time. They eat or they can't eat. Most of the time it's they can't sleep and they can't eat, but not for all. But there's a disturbance in a normal sleep or eating pattern. Chronic pelvic pain, we're looking at with physical health problems due to abused women. It could be sexual abuse. So we can have chronic pelvic problems. We can have urinary frequency. They can have irritable bowel syndrome. All of this is due to stress and being abused, recurrent vaginal infections, and sexual dysfunction. But when you're dealing with this and you're seeing this, whatever the patient actually says, the abused patient, you want to chart or note that in quotation marks, put it in their words. This is what it is. This is what's happening. Put it in quotes, and that is there in the chart. Remember, charting is a legal document. So it's so important that we capture that and document it appropriately. Nursing interventions. One of the things is, well, what do I do? Excuse me. I get that a lot. One thing that we can do is teach children how to cope. Excuse me. With anger, stress, frustration, we need to teach children how to cope. That's something that I find that's kind of missing anymore, is teaching coping mechanisms. Identify where a child can't cope and start to teach the mechanisms of how to deal with anger and stress, frustration, and teach them to communicate and to mediate if there's an issue and a problem, not to punch their way out of a problem or address the situation violently, but to step back and let's talk about it. Let's mediate. Let's have someone come and, someone on the outside, and go back and forth in a very civil way. Family programs to teach parents how to effectively respond to their children. Sometimes parents, children are born, there are no instructions on how to raise a child, how to talk to a child, but there are learned behaviors and there are things that we can do. Most people have a nurturing, natural want to take help and teach their child. They've learned from their parents. It's a learned behavior. We teach our children, and hopefully they'll teach their children. But we can initiate family programs to teach parents how to effectively respond to their children, especially if their children have issues. If you have a severely autistic child that seems to be violent, lash out violently, you can't physically hit them to try to subdue them. They need to learn how to deal. What are triggers? If it's an anger situation, what are triggers, and what can they do to not trigger the child, and deal with the child so that they don't become angry and lash out. So that is a good thing, is family programs. Preschool programs to teach intellectual and social skills. One of the biggest things our country did is to develop a preschool program out there so that we can get these children in and start to provide with them, teaching them, proper nutrition, teaching them their ABCs, teaching them to socialize with others, to share, to engage, to communicate. Those are the reasons why, and we want to do that, and we need to do that. It was identified very long ago that that was an issue and a problem, and that our children were coming in at a kindergarten, first grade age and not able, they're missing that beginning piece. So preschool programs are excellent and we love them. We want to plug these children in, start teaching them at 2, 3, 4 years of age before they end up in the public school system or private school system at kindergarten. Public education programs to teach different forms of violence and how to intervene. It's so important. We need to talk about gun violence. We need to talk about these things, and it needs to be age appropriate though. We don't need to take something that a 4-year-old can't even grasp and try to teach them, when we should be taking that problem and teaching at a middle school, high school age. We just need to be very appropriate how we provide this education, how we address the age that we're addressing and trying to engage and help. And then ding, 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 we lobby for passage of legislation to outlaw physical punishment in schools. We need to lobby for what we believe in. We need to lobby for passage to outlaw physical punishment in schools. That is spankings, physically spanking students, and marital rape. These are two issues that seem to have been accepted in our society or overlooked in our society. We look and turn our head. It's okay. But by doing this and physical punishment, they're looking at, we are then addressing behavior with a physical act. And it's better to not, and maybe try to teach or work through or find the problems. And same with marital rape. It's not okay for your husband or your wife to physically abuse and rape you. We can't turn the other way, but that's okay. Years and years ago, grandparents' age, my grandparents' age, that was not even addressed. You were the wife and that was it. And so that is something we can do. Nursing interventions continued. When speaking with clients or patients, always be respectful to the client and the abuser if they are present. When you are addressing the people that are there, you are respectful to all. You might think something, but it is an assumption. No one is guilty till proven guilty. You might know that the wife has said that the husband has abused her. He's standing there. It is not for you to stand up and throw that hand and act like you're going to make a stand for someone. We show respect because we need to get help for both parties, for the abused, the victim, and also the abuser. It's a sickness. It is a problem. It is something that needs to be addressed. We need to help the whole, not just the individual that we think should be protected. They all need to be helped. Encourage the family to provide ideas to prevent violence in the home. If there has been an abusive situation, open it up for the family to create, engage, have them think things through. What can you do? What can we do? What if dad every night comes home intoxicated and that's when he becomes violent? What as a family can we do? One, we need to get dad some help to try to get him off the drinking. But also, two, do we need to all be up, loud, running around, not to hide from dad, but how can we engage differently to hopefully prevent violence? If we need to be removed, I think we need to, remove ourselves from this situation, but encourage the family, because when the family can come up with a solution, usually it can be done. If it's someone else coming up with solutions, sometimes they're like, yeah, whatever, and they just don't feel. It's actually really giving them the energy and the ability to do something and create solutions for themselves. It's a good thing. And then just always remember, guys, by law, you must report child abuse to the Child Protective Services or the appropriate legal authority. I know in class I was talking about this, and I said, if you're in an ER, you want to go, if you suspect abuse, go and share with your physician. But the bottom line in testing and real world, no matter what, it is your responsibility to report child abuse. It is the law. It is legal. So if the physician won't do it or no one else seems it, and you're the one that initiated or saw this issue, you must report it. I hope that makes sense. If anybody has any questions on that in my class, because we talked about this in our last class, please just see me, email me, or we can talk in school. No worries. That wraps it up for the review on violence. I hope this helps.